Hi, I'm Rebecca Fuhrer from the Connecticut Historical Society, and welcome to Making Connecticut, our signature exhibit, which looks at 400 years of Connecticut history. We are going to look at just a few objects in this exhibit, but we wanted to give a quick overview so that you'd have a sense of what is here. We have objects that relate to people's everyday life. We have objects related to domestic life, kitchens throughout time, kitchens that you can visit and try things out. We have objects and stories related to work throughout time in Connecticut history. So here we're looking at early industrialization all the way through to today. We also have lots of hands-on activities for families and kids and adults to try out. So let's start by looking at this object. This is obviously an object that you're only going to find someplace like a museum. We always like to start with a very open-ended question with students, something like, what do you see here? And students might notice all sorts of different things. You'd be surprised. So first of all, it's something made out of wood. It looks kind of like a box. If you look closely, you'll begin to notice some details. There are some nails in the front here that show a little bit about the construction, how it's held together. The lid is bigger, the top of the box is bigger than the rest of the box. There's a lot of detail here. Talk about how these kinds of carvings would be made, probably by hand, like the whole rest of the box was probably made by hand as well. So you see a lot of different details, shapes like hearts and little squiggles, almost leaf-type details. And then if you look carefully, you can also see that there are some letters here, an A and a B. If you continue around the side of the box, you'll see that the sides and the top are much, much plainer than the front here. You can see a little bit about the hinges, the construction of the hinges, which comes up and through the top here. So it looks as if this lid hangs over here, and as you come around the side, you see that the sides and the top and the back are much, much plainer than the front. So if we continue to look carefully, you can see that the lid is splitting apart a tiny, tiny bit. It's held together with some nails that don't look like nails we would use today. They're not uniform. They all look a little bit different on the top. You can also see a little bit more about the construction on the side, how the hinge starts in the back and comes up through the top of the box over here. These are all things that students might notice if they have a chance to look really carefully at the box. Then there's some things that we can add to the story that are separate from what you can see. So in addition to the things that we can see and determine just by looking, for instance, the fact that this was probably made by hand, carved by hand, probably made a long time ago when you look at the nails and the construction details like that. We can also learn more just from the information that comes along with the object when it comes to the museum. So for instance, in this case, A, B are the initials of the woman who owned the box. And the fact that it's a woman who owned the box is something that's kind of unusual about objects that are this age. So this box is from the 1600s, and in the 1600s, most property belonged to men. But in the case of things like boxes like this, that could have been the property of a woman. In this case, Abigail Ball, who owned this box, and she would have used it to store personal items, some special things that belonged to the household, possibly some silverware or linens, some jewelry, lace collars, something that might have belonged to her. And therefore, it's an object that would have passed down from a woman to her daughter, to her granddaughter, rather than passing through the male line, as most other objects in this time period, such as chairs or chests or other furniture, tools, would have done. The next object that we're going to look at comes from a little bit later on in Connecticut history. And again, I would start with a very open-ended question like, what do you see here? Students might notice all kinds of things. It looks kind of like a barrel, but it's not exactly a barrel. But they might notice that it is made similar to a barrel with pieces of wood, which we call staves, that are held together by an iron hoop. But once you look at the top and on the inside, you realize it's definitely not just a barrel. It has a whole mechanism here that looks like it was made more in a factory or in an industrial setting. It has a crank that you would turn, and on the inside it has some pieces that look like they probably would go round and round and round. It has half a lid, so it's only open on one side right now. And it also has some interesting writing on it, some details that you might notice if you began to look very carefully. In this case, it actually says home washer, and it repeats that on the outside of the iron crank. From the inside, you can figure out that you would put your clothing in there along with some soap and some water and turn the crank in order to spin it around. So it was like a very early washing machine. It's a step up from having to scrub all of your clothes using a washboard or a scrub board. So it's partially automated, but certainly not like our washing machines today. Why would you have something like this? Well, in the late 1800s, late 19th century, laundry and standards of cleanliness were becoming more and more important. So people wanted to look clean. They were looking for some labor-saving devices, and this would have been definitely a step up from doing this all by hand. So this would have been made in some sort of factory, but parts of it clearly would have been made by hand as well. So for instance, all of these staves probably would have been carved by hand. There would have been the individual pieces would be made by hand, and then they would be all constructed together. Students might or might not recognize this object as a sewing machine, but there are a lot of interesting details that you can notice when you begin to look very carefully. And those details can tell us something both about the sewing machine industry and how they were constructed, and also about their use in the home. When you begin to look more closely, you'll notice that the sewing machine itself is only a small part of this object. So there's the actual sewing machine and the mechanism for powering it. It wasn't powered by electricity, it was powered by foot power. So there's a treadle for pumping down here at the base. But you'll also notice as you begin to look more carefully a lot of interesting details about this object. It's very elaborately carved. There's a lot of fancy carving here and very pretty little handles on all of the drawer pulls. So it wasn't just made to be a utilitarian object, it was also clearly made to be something decorative that you would have in your household. This machine was made around 1880s by Wheeler and Wilson, which was a sewing machine manufacturer in Bridgeport. There were sewing machines produced in various industrialized cities in America at the time. This particular machine would have been made in parts in different areas of the factory. So there would have been people building the actual machines and the mechanisms, and then there would be a case shop for constructing and carving and decorating the casework, the cabinetry that goes along with it. The workers in the factory itself probably made between $1.25 and $2.50 for a day's work, and a day's work would have been about 10 hours long. In this case, the sewing machine like this would have been sold for between $10 and $20 to a consumer. The consumers were mostly women. There were great advantages to having a sewing machine over having to do your sewing by hand. You could sew much faster. The stitches were all very uniform. So you could be producing clothes more easily in your home. You could be sewing clothes to outfit other people. They also would have used sewing machines like this in factories for making clothing, although they probably wouldn't have had such elaborate detail on them. Today we've just selected 3 objects to look at. These 3 objects happen to tell a story about women and their lives and their work over the centuries. Here in Making Connecticut, we have more than 500 objects, images, historical documents that can tell all sorts of different stories, from daily life to Connecticut at war, transportation, changes in fashion, changes in work practices, and anything else you can imagine. We'd love to have you come and visit on your own, with your class, with your family. Thanks.